It was a crisp afternoon in the heart of Grayville, a small city where everyone seemed to know each other. The town had a unique charm, blending the modernity of towering high-rises with the timeless appeal of family-owned shops. Despite its appeal, there was an undercurrent of unease that lingered beneath the surface. Dana Carter, an elegant woman in her early 30s, stepped out of a bustling local cafe, her favorite spot for a midday coffee break. After savoring her drink, she headed toward her car parked just a short distance away. Dana, married to the city's police commissioner Ethan Carter, valued her privacy and made a conscious effort to lead a low-profile life, avoiding special treatment because of her husband's role. As Dana walked toward her car, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the pavement. The street was relatively quiet, punctuated only by the distant hum of passing cars and the occasional chatter from nearby pedestrians. She was lost in thought, replaying the peaceful moments she had just spent in the cafe, when she noticed two uniformed officers heading in her direction. Their deliberate approach immediately drew her attention, and her steps slowed. The officers, Blake and Thomas, moved with purpose. As they reached her, they stopped abruptly, positioning themselves to block her path. Their sharp, scrutinizing gazes swept over her, as if they were dissecting her with their eyes. The tension between them was almost tangible, like a coiled spring ready to snap. "Excuse me, ma'am," Officer Blake said, his voice clipped and formal. "We need to ask you a few questions." Dana blinked, caught off guard. The moment felt surreal, the normalcy of her day suddenly disrupted. She paused, her heart quickening, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Is something wrong, officers?" she asked, her tone polite but tinged with confusion. Blake briefly exchanged a glance with his partner, Thomas, who stepped forward with an air of authority. His expression was impassive, but his voice carried a hard edge. "We've received reports of suspicious activity in this area. We need to search you," he stated bluntly, as though the matter required no further explanation. Dana's brow furrowed, her confusion deepening. She instinctively hugged her coat closer to herself, feeling a prickle of discomfort. "Suspicious activity," she repeated, her voice steady but uncertain. "I just left the cafe a moment ago. Is there a specific reason you need to search me?" Blake crossed his arms over his chest, his posture rigid. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze narrowing as though her question was itself an act of defiance. "Are you refusing to be searched?" he asked, his tone firm, almost accusatory. Dana's instincts flared, a mix of alarm and indignation surging within her. She had done nothing wrong, and yet the weight of their scrutiny made her feel cornered. Despite this, she took a deep breath and kept her voice calm. "No, I'm not refusing," she said slowly, her eyes meeting Blake's. "But do you have any reason to believe I've done something wrong?" Thomas, standing just a step behind Blake, shifted forward abruptly. The movement was sharp, almost aggressive, as he reached toward the handcuffs dangling from his belt. "Turn around," he ordered curtly, his voice cold and detached. "We need to search you." Dana froze, stunned by the sudden escalation. The sight of the handcuffs sent a jolt of disbelief through her. "Search me," she repeated, her voice rising slightly in protest. "Why? I haven't done anything wrong." Her words hung in the air, a plea for reason that neither officer seemed inclined to acknowledge. The moment stretched, heavy with tension, as passers-by began to notice the commotion. Some slowed their pace, their faces betraying a mix of curiosity and unease, while others hurried past, avoiding eye contact as though afraid to be drawn into the unfolding scene. Dana's mind raced. She was a law-abiding citizen, a woman who had done nothing more than enjoy a quiet coffee break. And yet here she was, being treated as though she were a criminal. The injustice of it stung, but she knew better than to let her frustration show. Any resistance, no matter how justified, could make things worse. "Officers," she said, her voice firm despite the turmoil swirling inside her, "I'm more than willing to cooperate, but I need to understand why you're doing this. What exactly do you think I've done?" Blake's jaw tightened, his expression unreadable. Thomas, however, moved closer still, his hand brushing the cuffs. The growing sense of power imbalance was palpable, and Dana could feel the eyes of the bystanders on her, their silent observations amplifying her vulnerability. The scene was spiraling out of her control, and for the first time, a flicker of fear joined the indignation burning in her chest. Blake's expression hardened into a scowl, his tone sharp and unyielding. "Turn around, ma'am. Don't make this more difficult than it has to be." Dana's heart sank as she realized the futility of further protest. Around her, pedestrians continued to walk by, their faces deliberately turned away, avoiding the escalating scene. Some cast furtive glances, their curiosity fleeting, but none paused to intervene. The air was thick with unspoken discomfort, the city's usual bustle muted by the tension. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, and slowly turned around. The clinking sound of the handcuffs locking around her wrists sent a shiver through her, the cold metal biting into her skin. It wasn't just the physical sensation, it was the symbolic weight of being restrained, treated as though she were dangerous, as though she had done something wrong. Thomas began the search with a brusqueness that made her skin crawl. He tugged at her coat, patting her down roughly, his hands moving with little regard for her dignity. He rifled through her handbag, pulling out items as though searching for contraband. The contents, a wallet, a phone, a neatly folded receipt from the cafe, seemed mundane, yet he examined them as though they might hide a dark secret. Each motion felt invasive, a violation of her personhood, and a deep sense of humiliation swept over her. She kept her head high, refusing to let the shame show on her face, but inside, she felt like a spectacle, exposed and vulnerable. The murmurs of passing onlookers reached her ears, faint but distinct, adding to the weight of the moment. When Thomas finally stepped back, his expression remained cold and impassive, as though nothing about the experience had been out of the ordinary. Blake stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You sure you're not hiding anything?" he asked, his tone accusatory. Dana clenched her jaw, willing herself to remain composed. "I'd like to call my husband," she said, her voice steady but firm. Blake's lips curled into a mocking smile. "Oh," he said, his tone laced with condescension. "And who might that be? Go ahead, call him. Let's see who he is." Without responding, Dana turned her head slightly to meet his gaze, her eyes calm but unyielding. She was no longer afraid. Freeing her hands as the cuffs were removed, she retrieved her phone from her handbag. "You'll find out soon enough," she replied evenly, her fingers moving swiftly to dial. The phone barely rang twice before a deep, authoritative voice answered. "Dana, what's wrong?" Ethan Carter's voice was unmistakable, steady, commanding, and laced with concern. Dana exhaled slowly, letting the tension ease just enough to explain. "They're searching me, Ethan," she said, her tone carefully controlled, though frustration edged her words. "Officers Blake and Thomas. I'm at Olive and Maple. I just left the cafe, and they're treating me like a criminal." A pause followed on the other end of the line, the silence charged with unspoken anger. Then, Ethan's voice returned, calm but resolute. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." As she ended the call, Dana glanced back at the officers. Their earlier smugness had begun to waver. Blake's mocking smile faltered, and Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting by his sides. The air around them seemed to change, the weight of impending consequences pressing down on their bravado. Dana straightened her shoulders, her resolve renewed. She knew Ethan would handle the situation, but the sting of what she had endured was still fresh. Standing there, she no longer felt like a victim. Instead, she was someone who had endured injustice and was ready to see it corrected. Dana stood taller, bolstered by the knowledge that her husband was on his way. Yet the sting of being wrongly accused lingered, fresh and sharp. Minutes later, a black SUV pulled up, coming to a sudden stop. The door swung open, and Ethan Carter stepped out, his imposing presence unmistakable in his commissioner's uniform. His expression was stern, his eyes flashing with anger as he approached. The officers froze, their confidence evaporating as they recognized him. "Commissioner Carter," Blake stammered, stepping forward as if to explain. Ethan's icy glare stopped him in his tracks. "Step aside," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. The officers quickly backed away, their previous bravado replaced with unease. Ethan turned to Dana, his expression softening as he checked her over. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. Dana nodded, though the humiliation still weighed on her. "I'm fine," she said quietly, then glanced at the officers, who stood stiffly nearby. Ethan's face hardened again as he turned back to them. "You two," he said sharply, "explain yourselves." Blake shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting to Thomas, who remained silent. "We received reports of suspicious activity, sir." "She matched the description," Blake mumbled. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Matched the description? Of what, exactly? Did she resist? Did she threaten you in any way?" "No, sir," Thomas muttered, his voice barely audible. The street, once bustling, had grown eerily quiet. Spectators stood at a distance, watching the scene unfold in tense silence. Ethan stepped forward, his tall frame radiating authority, his voice now edged with a biting chill. "Then why," he asked, his words precise and deliberate, "did you feel compelled to harass her? Was it because she's black? Was that your only justification?" Blake stammered, his earlier bravado entirely gone. "Sir, we were just following protocol." "Your protocol is broken," Ethan snapped, his voice rising with a quiet fury. "And you're about to face the consequences." The tension was palpable, hanging thick in the cold air. The two officers stood frozen, realizing they had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Without breaking his piercing gaze, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With measured calm, he dialed Internal Affairs. "I want Officers Blake and Thomas placed under immediate investigation," Ethan said, his tone steady but unyielding. "They are to be suspended from duty pending a full inquiry." The finality in his words made it clear there would be no second chances. Blake's face turned ashen, his lips quivering as he tried to plead. "Sir, we didn't mean to." Ethan's sharp look silenced him mid-sentence. "Didn't mean to what?" he retorted. "Didn't mean to harass my wife? Didn't mean to treat her as less than human? Or didn't mean to get caught?" Thomas, who had been silent until now, stepped forward hesitantly. His voice shook as he spoke. It was a mistake, sir. We were just doing our job." "A mistake?" Ethan echoed, his tone heavy with disbelief and anger. "A mistake that could have spiraled into something far worse. Do you think that excuses your behavior? Does it justify your lack of humanity?" The street had become a silent courtroom, with onlookers as the jury. Whispers rippled through the crowd, some exchanging concerned glances, others standing motionless, transfixed by the scene unfolding before them. Within minutes, officers from Internal Affairs arrived. Blake and Thomas were pulled aside, their earlier confidence now replaced by visible fear and regret. The smugness that had tainted their demeanor earlier had completely evaporated. They were no longer untouchable, the weight of accountability was bearing down on them. As the officers were led away for questioning, Dana stood quietly beside Ethan, a mix of emotions swirling within her. Relief washed over her, but it was tinged with a deep sadness. She had been targeted not for anything she had done, but simply for who she was, a stark reminder of the prejudice that still lingered in society. Ethan turned to her, his expression softening as he took her hands in his. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," he said, his voice low and full of regret. "It won't happen again. Not while I'm here." Dana gave him a small, weary smile. "Thank you for coming. I didn't know what else to do." "You did exactly what you should have," Ethan reassured her, wrapping a protective arm around her shoulder. And now, those officers will face the consequences. As they walked away from the scene, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder. Grayville would not soon forget what had happened that day. It was a moment that revealed the ugly undercurrents of prejudice, but also a moment when justice had been served swiftly and publicly. The reckoning had been a stark reminder that no one, not even the police, was above the law. For Dana, the pain of the experience would linger, a scar etched deeply into her memory. But as Ethan held her close, she found solace in knowing that change had been set into motion. Grayville had witnessed a lesson in accountability, one that would ripple far beyond the city's borders.